10 Unavoidable Problems with a Living Minimum Wage, From 100% Waste of Your Money to Millions Unemployed, by Steve Baba, Ph.D. Using non-technical language and a dialogue format, this short book explains the problems with a high living minimum wage and the misleading minimum wage arguments. Economics concepts are presented in a Socratic discussion with a labor activist at McDonald's. Steve Baba has a Ph.D. in economics from the University of Maryland at College Park and has taught economics in the United States, Europe, and Asia. Introduction. Winning one battle does not win the war. Economist. This McDonald's sure seems busy. Activist. Our group is trying to raise the minimum wage. Care to sign a petition to get these workers a fair wage of $15 per hour? Everyone deserves a raise. Everyone deserves a living wage. Economist. I can see that you have compassion for minimum wage workers, but making millions of them unemployed will not help them. Activist. We have new studies that show raising the minimum wage will not reduce employment much, if any. It's the new economics. Virtually the same number of workers will be working here at this McDonald's when the minimum wage is raised to $10 or even $15 per hour. Economist. I'm an economist myself, and I've seen those studies, but I doubt that raising the price of hamburgers will not reduce the demand for hamburgers, or raising the price of labor, raising the minimum wage, will not reduce the demand for minimum wage workers. But for the sake of argument, even if those new economic studies are right, and the same number of people will be working here at this McDonald's after raising the minimum wage to $10 or $15, there will be unemployment, discrimination against the disadvantaged, a waste of 100% of your money, and other problems. Activist. If the same number of people will be working at this McDonald's when the minimum wage is raised to $10 or $15, how will there be more unemployment? Economist. If the minimum wage is raised to $10 or $15 an hour, people willing to work at McDonald's for $8, $9, $10, $11, $12, $13, $14, and $15 an hour will apply for jobs at this McDonald's. There will be more people applying for, at best, the same number of jobs, so millions of them will be unemployed. Do you want millions of people to be unemployed? Activist. No, I don't want millions of people to be unemployed, but this paper says that employment will not change. Economist. You've been misled. Employment is not the same thing as unemployment. An economy with 100 million people working or employed and 4 million people unemployed is not the same as an economy with 100 million people working or employed and 10 million people unemployed. 6 million more people are unemployed and looking for work. Activist. 6 million more unemployed does not sound good. Economist. Even with, at best, the same number of people working at this McDonald's at a $10 or $15 minimum wage, there will be far more job applicants than positions at McDonald's. See that McDonald's manager standing there? Who do you think he's not going to hire because there are better job applicants? Activist. The cashier who took my order sounded like a recent immigrant who could barely speak English and had a difficult time taking my order. If the manager had a choice, I suppose that manager would not hire recent immigrants who could not speak decent English. I was nice to the cashier who made a mistake taking my order because of the language difference, but other customers are not so nice. I've seen customers get upset at cashiers who could not understand their orders and walk out. I often see mistaken orders here where wrong orders have to be thrown out and customers given new meals. Economist. The disadvantaged workers or low productivity workers such as the cashier you described are not going to get hired. Milton Friedman called minimum wage laws discrimination against the disadvantaged. Activist. I just want to help the poor get a raise, not unemploy millions or discriminate against the disadvantaged. Economist. It's a trite phrase, but the road to hell is paved with good intentions. I would like to be able to say giving everyone a raise to $10 or $15 an hour won't cost much, but it's just not true. Activists. Are these economic studies that say a high minimum wage will not reduce the number of jobs true? Economist. Some of these economic studies may be partly true, mostly true, or even entirely true. Activist. If these studies might be mostly true or entirely true, what am I doing wrong? Economist. Did the Japanese win at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941? Activist. Yes, the Japanese did win at Pearl Harbor. Economist. Did the Japanese win World War II? Activist. No, the Japanese lost World War II. Economist. Even without 2020 hindsight, if someone argued that because the Japanese won at Pearl Harbor, the Japanese would win the war, would you agree? Activist. No, winning one battle is a far cry from winning a war. Economist. Minimum wage activists may have won one argument or one battle, but just because one battle was won, the war is not won. The Japanese effectively lost the war the minute they attacked Pearl Harbor. Likewise, a high living minimum wage is strategic folly from the start, or as Milton Friedman stated, a monument to the power of superficial thinking. Number 1. Millions more unemployed even if the number of jobs remains constant. Economist. See that gas station across the street selling gasoline for $3.50 a gallon? Suppose you worked for an Arab oil cartel and conducted a survey of gas stations in New Jersey years ago and found that after a 25-cent state gasoline tax increase, which raised the at-pump price of gasoline by 25 cents, the gallons of gasoline sold remained constant. You might be tempted to think, we can raise the price of gasoline from today's $3.50 to $5 or even $7 a gallon. Activist. If raising the price of gasoline does not reduce the number of gallons sold at the pump, couldn't the Arab oil cartel raise the price of gasoline to $5 or even $7 and pocket the price increase? Economist. If gasoline increased to $5 or $7 a gallon, what would American and other non-Arab oil producers do? Activist. If gasoline increased to $5 or $7 a gallon, American oil producers would turn on less productive oil wells. Old oil wells that were shut down because their cost of producing oil was $4 per gallon would be reopened. There would be more oil on the market at $5 or $7 than at $3.50. Economist. And if the same amount of gasoline is sold in New Jersey and nationwide, and Americans are producing more gasoline, the Arab oil cartel will sell fewer gallons. Activist. But the same number of gallons of gasoline is being sold. Economist. True, the same amount of gasoline is being sold, but American gasoline sales are replacing Arab oil cartel sales. The same thing would happen to minimum wage workers. Suppose you formed a 2014 minimum wage workers cartel and conducted a survey of fast food restaurants in New Jersey and found that after a past minimum wage increase, the number of minimum wage workers remained constant. You might be tempted to think, we can raise the price of labor from today's $7.25 to $10 or $15 an hour. But the 2014 minimum wage workers cartel is similar to the Arab oil cartel and will lose jobs to other workers when the wage is raised. Economist. Just looking around this McDonald's, can you see people who might work for McDonald's even if the minimum wage was raised from $7.25 to $10 or $15? Activist. Some of those students sitting there wasting time might decide to work if the wage was $10 or $15 an hour. Some of those retired people reading newspapers might decide to work if the wage was $10 or $15 an hour. That mother with 2 kids in the corner might decide to work. Even some of those homeless people, if they're able to, might decide to work at $10 or $15 an hour. Economist. So when the minimum wage is increased to $10 or $15 an hour, we will have more people applying for the same number of jobs at McDonald's. McDonald's won't hire them all. Millions of people will be unemployed. Activists often omit this fact or hide it in the very back of their studies. In Santa Fe, the showcase example of where a high living wage worked, in the book A Measure of Fairness, when the minimum wage was increased, even though the number of jobs did not decline, likely due to a rising overall economy, more people were willing to work for the higher minimum wage, and the number of unemployed people approximately doubled. Activist. This activist group told me that unemployment would not change. Economist. If they were smart and careful, the activist group may have told you that employment would not change or fall very slightly, but employment people working at jobs, is not the same as unemployment, which is people looking for jobs who can't find jobs. In our example of the Arab oil cartel, the gallons of gasoline sold remained constant, but the gasoline supplied by American companies increased. So, at $5 or $7 a gallon, the supply of gasoline is greater than the demand for gasoline. At $5 or $7 a gallon, there would be much unsold gasoline. Every cartel knows this. Economist. Likewise, in the example of the 2014 minimum wage workers cartel, the number of workers employed remained constant, but work supplied by other workers increased. So at $10 or $15 an hour, the supply of labor is greater than the demand for labor. At $10 or $15 an hour, there would be much unemployed labor. Economist. This unsold gasoline or unemployed labor is easy to see on a supply and demand diagram at an above equilibrium price, even if the demand curve is perfectly inelastic, or straight up and down at a fixed number of workers, jobs, or gasoline. Number 2. Just as the wrong high-cost oil will be used at a too high price, the wrong high-cost labor will be used at a too high wage, reducing total output. Economist. If the Arab oil cartel increases the price of gasoline to $7 per gallon, what is the highest cost gasoline American oil companies will produce? Activist. If an Arab oil cartel increases the price of gasoline to $7 per gallon, won't American oil companies open their wells and produce all the oil for gasoline they can up to a cost of $7 per gallon? Economist. Right. The inexpensive $2 and $3 a gallon oil that easily flows out of the ground will still be produced, but also more expensive $4 a gallon gasoline, $5 a gallon gasoline, $6 a gallon gasoline, and even $7 a gallon gasoline will be produced. If gasoline was at the free market price of $3.50, the additional men and capital producing $5, $6, and even $7 a gallon gasoline could have been used to produce other things. It's not a zero-sum game. It's a waste of men and capital that reduces total output. Activist. Spending $6 or $7 a gallon to produce a gallon of gasoline that was previously produced for under $3.50 does not sound good. Economist. Making oil drillers and refineries do $7 of work for a gallon of gasoline wastes all of the price increase paid. Nobody gains. All or 100% of the $7 higher price paid will be wasted on higher production costs if the gasoline was produced at $7 per gallon. Most of the higher price paid will be wasted on higher production costs if the production cost was $6 per gallon. Almost half of the higher price paid for gasoline will be wasted on higher production costs for gasoline produced at $5 per gallon. 50 cents of the high price paid for gasoline will be wasted on higher production costs if the gasoline was produced at $4 per gallon. Activist. Is this waste the same in the labor market? Economist. Exactly. Raising the price of labor, the wage rate from $7.25 to $15 will attract higher opportunity cost workers to compete for the limited number of jobs. Economist. It's easier to see for someone who was working producing something else, say painting houses, at a fair market wage of $15 an hour. But after the minimum wage increased to $15 per hour, decides to work at a job that formerly paid $7.25, say at McDonald's, but now pays $15 an hour. He's still making $15 an hour, so he's no better off financially, but we're paying him $7.75 more per hour than the previous McDonald's worker. It's a 100% waste of the $7.75 pay increase since nobody is better off. And society is losing the value of the $15 per hour work that he previously did painting houses. Activist. Is this just like the oil example where we would pay $7 a gallon and a high $7 price would not make the $7 a gallon cost producer any better off? Economist. Exactly. It's just harder to see with labor than with products such as gasoline, since often labor is not working in the paid labor market. Take that mom over there taking care of her kids. If the minimum wage was increased to $15 per hour, she might decide to work at McDonald's instead of staying home with her kids. Since taking care of the kids is not paid for with money, economists usually overlook the opportunity cost of working at home or even leisure, since it's hard to measure the value of working at home or leisure. You can't just say the mom is $15 better off working since she has to give up her time with her children. She might value time with her kids at $14 or even $15 an hour. So once again, most or 100% of the increase in wages would be wasted. It's just economists often don't or can't put a dollar value on the opportunity cost of caring for her kids, who are now latchkey kids. Activist. The kids are now latchkey kids. The mom is not any happier because she is just willing to work for $15, and some other worker who really needed the job was replaced by the mom. This sounds awful. Economist. It even leads to discrimination against the disadvantaged, which is not only bad economically, but unethical to deprive people of work because they drew the short straw in life. Milton Friedman called minimum wage laws mandatory discrimination against the disadvantaged. This may be easier to see in the case of bad or disadvantaged oil. Number 3. Mandatory discrimination against the disadvantaged. Nobody will buy disadvantaged oil or hire disadvantaged labor. Economist. Some members of our fictional Arab oil cartel, no relation to OPEC, produce good oil, which is light, sweet crude oil. Other members of the cartel have oil that is just not as good. Some oil is heavy, sour oil, which is more difficult and more expensive to refine. If the Arab oil cartel fixed the price of all oil at one single price, would people buy the good oil or the bad oil first? Activist. People would buy the good oil first and the bad oil last if they bought the bad oil at all. Economist. Any oil cartel knows this and allows the bad oil to be priced lower than the good oil to compensate for the lower quality. Economist. Some members of our fictional 2014 minimum wage workers cartel are better workers than others. Not every worker can be above average. Some people are below average. Some members of the 2014 minimum wage workers cartel are just not good workers. They are disadvantaged workers, who are just not as smart, strong, or experienced as other workers. If the 2014 minimum wage workers cartel fixed the wage of all workers at $15 per hour, would employees hire advantaged or disadvantaged workers first? Activist. Just like with oil, employers will hire the good advantaged workers first and the bad disadvantaged workers last if they hire the disadvantaged workers at all. Economist. Many, if not most or all, disadvantaged workers will not be hired. In addition to the huge personal loss to the unemployed individuals, this is a loss to society. Although they are not the most productive workers, they would be producing something if they were employed. For example, a grocery store chain in my city used to hire the developmentally disadvantaged or retarded to retrieve shopping carts and do limited cleaning, which is about the most they could do. At $5 an hour, these developmentally disadvantaged were covering or close to covering their costs. I suspect these hires were partly, but not completely, charity hires. But at $7.25, $10, or $15 an hour, they are too expensive relative to their low productivity to employ. Activist. Could we have lower minimum wages for disadvantaged workers like there are lower prices for bad oil? Economist. In the past, there were lower sub-minimum wages for teenagers or training wages, but exceptions to the minimum wage undercut its claims for a fair, just, or living wage. One can't claim that $15 an hour is needed to be fair and live on, but then make exceptions for the disadvantaged. And deciding who is disadvantaged enough to qualify for sub-minimum wages would cause obvious problems. Activist. Won't the disadvantaged workers eventually find jobs after a long time? Economist. In the long run, it looks worse for the disadvantaged as more people decide to become or remain minimum wage workers for life and don't even try to get better than minimum wage jobs. Number 4. In the long run, at $7 per gallon gasoline, more people will drill for oil. In the long run, at $10 or $15 minimum wage, more people will choose to become or stay minimum wage workers for life. Economist. In the long run, if gasoline remains at $7 per gallon, do you think more people in the USA will drill for oil? Activist. Obviously, more oil will be searched for and found, although finding oil might take some time. More people would study oil production in school. More people will become roughnecks working in oil fields. Economist. In the long run, if the minimum wage is $15 per hour, do you think more people in the USA will decide to become minimum wage workers? Activist. Obviously, more people will decide to become minimum wage workers at $15 per hour than at $7.25 per hour. Economist. When I was growing up, I was repeatedly told, if you don't want to end up in a dead-end minimum wage job, stay in school or learn a trade. Aren't you doing the same thing today? Activist. Teachers and parents still tell us something like, if you don't want to end up in a dead-end minimum wage job, stay in school or learn a trade. But at $15 per hour minimum wage, I suppose some people will drop out of school or not bother to learn a trade. Economist. Both of us and most people are lucky enough to earn well above the minimum wage. Our education or work training decisions won't be changed by the minimum wage, but a significant fraction of the labor force is not as fortunate as we are. Economist. If someone had a choice between a $15 per hour minimum wage job and a $15 per hour semi-skilled job that required a year of schooling, everything else being equal, would anyone undertake any unpaid training for a job paying just $15 an hour? Activist. Now that I think about it, if anyone could walk into any mall and get a minimum wage job paying $15 per hour, why would anyone undertake any training or schooling for a job that pays the same? Economist. Everything else being equal, it would be stupid for anyone to undertake any schooling or unpaid training for a minimum wage job when there are similar jobs available paying the same minimum wage that don't require any unpaid training or schooling. There have been econometric studies on the effect of smaller, not to $10 an hour, minimum wage increases on education. These studies showed that a higher minimum wage encourages people to reduce their education by dropping out of school. It apparently does not take much of a raise to incentivize some students to drop out of school at the margin, such as students already close to dropping out. These studies also show that the most disadvantaged workers, such as junior high school dropouts, are replaced by better workers, such as high school graduates, when the minimum wage is raised. Activist. I know some high school friends who are content with their current minimum wage jobs and still live with their parents. I and their parents hope they will grow out of it. But if the minimum wage job pays $15 an hour, they might decide to stay in their minimum wage jobs the rest of their lives and become minimum wage lifers. Economist. If a few million people pass on education or training since a $15 minimum wage job is good enough for them, what do you think will happen? Activist. Millions of more people will be looking for $15 an hour minimum wage jobs, and fewer people will be looking for jobs that require unpaid training or schooling. Economist. And with a few more million workers looking for minimum wage jobs, even if unemployment, the number of jobs, stays the same, unemployment will rise by millions. In the long run, as people pass on education or training because a $15 an hour minimum wage jobs are good enough for them, the supply curve of unskilled workers shifts to the right. Likewise, in the skilled labor market, the supply curve shifts to the left. Economist. As people pass on education and training because minimum wage jobs are good enough, what will happen to the average education and training level? Activist. The average level of education and training will fall. Economist. And when the average level of education and training falls, what will happen to the GNP, gross national product, or value of all goods and services produced? Activist. With less training and education, GNP will fall. Economist. Unemployment will increase. Training, education, and GNP will all decline. Disadvantaged workers will have more competition for the limited number of jobs. Minimum wage job seekers will spend more time searching for the fewer minimum wage job openings. Number 5, job lock and few minimum wage job openings. People will be locked into whatever minimum wage jobs they find, even if it's the worst job for them. Economist. In addition to more workers applying for the same number of $15 per hour minimum wage jobs, supply of workers far exceeding the demand at an above equilibrium wage, do you think more or fewer people will quit $15 per hour jobs compared to $7.25 per hour jobs? Activist. Obviously, fewer people will quit $15 per hour jobs when it's hard to find a new job. Economist. People will be stuck or locked into whatever $15 per hour job they are lucky enough to find. This is sometimes called job lock because with few other job openings, one is locked into a job. Activist. But isn't this a cost-saving advantage since it reduces turnover costs to businesses, as this activist brochure claims? Economist. Minimum wage advocates often point to the lower turnover of workers at a higher wage. While job lock does save some hiring and training costs, job lock imposes other costs. By definition, having a lower turnover means fewer job openings. A fast food job may not be the best, but it is possible to find a fast food job in most places today. If fast food jobs are held by $15 per hour minimum wage lifers, do you think it will be easier or harder to find a fast food job in the future? Activist. Obviously, it will be much harder to find a fast food job or most other $15 an hour jobs. Economist. Not all jobs are the same to all people, a fact often overlooked by economists who just look at the numbers of employed and unemployed. Some people are into fashion and would like to work at a dress store. Other people are into sports and would like to work at a sporting goods store. Other people are into cooking and would like to work at a restaurant. At a free market $8 or $9 an hour wage, there might be one opening every month at the dress store, one opening at the sports store, and one opening at the restaurant. At $15 per hour, maybe there would be one job opening every 2 or 3 months at just one of the 3 stores. Economist. So if you were applying for a summer job and there was only one job opening, you would have to take that job even if it was the last place you wanted to work or the next to last place you wanted to work. Job satisfaction will plummet. Activist. So more people would be working in jobs looking across the mall wishing they were working at a different store. Economist. Yes, but this misallocation of resources is hard if not impossible to measure, so economists almost always skip it. In addition to the job dissatisfaction of working at your last choice job, since your last choice job is not in a field that you will stay in, much of the on-the-job training is wasted on the wrong workers. Economist. How many minimum wage or near minimum wage jobs did you have in high school and college? Activist. I had about a half dozen part-time jobs. Economist. I suppose, like most people, you were able to try out various jobs and eventually discover work you liked and maybe make a career of one of them. Activist. I did try out a few jobs, including being a fast food cook, which I found out was not for me. But I eventually found that I like logistics, which is now my career. Of course, my start in logistics was as an entry-level shipping and receiving level clerk. I'm now a logistics manager. Economist. If minimum wage lifers working for $15 an hour kept most of the minimum wage jobs for life, you might not have gotten that entry-level logistics job. You might have been lucky to find a fast food job that paid the same minimum wage as the logistics job, but that you disliked and did not provide you with logistics training. Economist. It's not that fast food jobs are bad for everyone. Some people like cooking. I had one friend who, after he got an overpaid union job as a Washington Post printing press mechanic because his father worked there, quit to become a cook. Economist. Everyone will have to spend much more time searching for the few $15 per hour minimum wage job openings, and even when they find the few job openings, chances are the opening will be a much worse match for them than they could have found in a free employment market. Disadvantaged workers, young, inexperienced workers, and very old workers will have to spend much more time looking for jobs they may never find. The cost of searching for jobs is one rent-seeking cost. Number 6. Wasteful rent-seeking job search costs. Economist. If the government passed a law fixing the price of a hamburger meal at $15, what do you think would happen? Activist. I remember this from my Econ 101 class. The textbook used the example of the government setting high airline ticket prices in the past. The airlines thought they would pocket the higher prices for themselves, but airlines started adding costly features such as sexier mini-skirted flight attendants in the 1960s and gourmet in-flight meals. The airlines also spent more money on advertising to try to sell more tickets. Economist. I can see you paid attention in Econ 101. What do you think McDonald's and other hamburger chains would do if the government passed a law saying that the price of a hamburger meal, a hamburger with fries and a drink, must be $15? Activist. Just like the airlines, I would expect McDonald's to spend more on advertising. McDonald's and Burger King would make their hamburgers larger. Instead of a quarter-pound hamburger and 4 ounces of French fries for $15, they would give us a half-pound hamburger with a half-pound of fries. The tables might get bigger. Every McDonald's or Burger King would look like an upscale restaurant as they compete to sell $15 hamburger meals. It's not the 1960s, but having mini-skirted waitresses serve hamburgers might attract some customers. Economist. Most, if not all, of the $15 hamburger meals price increase would be competed away. Most of this is a waste of resources. People would literally be leaving half of their French fries uneaten on their plates. While I might enjoy a few more bites of hamburger, and the hamburger would be of slightly better quality, I would not enjoy it enough to pay more for it, if given the choice, or I would not be eating here at this McDonald's now. If I really wanted to pay $15 for a nice, organic hamburger meal, I would be at the mall at Elevation Burger. Activist. I agree that having the government fix the price of a hamburger meal would lead to costly rent-seeking, but what does this have to do with the minimum wage? Economist. Just as when the government sets the price of a hamburger meal too high at $15 and businesses compete away much of the price increase, when the price of labor, wage, is set too high, workers or job seekers will compete away much of the wage increase. If you're willing to work for $7.25 an hour, your reservation wage, and minimum wage jobs paid $15, how long would you search for a job? Activist. If the wages were high, workers would spend a lot of time on job searches. Economist. In the worst case, minimum wage workers might spend, in time and money, the entire increase in the minimum wage on job searching. A worker willing to work for $7.50 an hour might spend an unpaid 100 hours searching for a summer job for just 100 hours of part-time work in the summer. So with 100 hours spent on the job search and 100 hours actually working at the summer job, his effective pay is back down to $7.50 an hour. 100% of the pay increase was wasted by the increased job search time. Activist. Longer job searches do not sound good. Economist. In addition to the above-board job searches such as applying to store after store, week after week, month after month, or networking to meet someone who might be hiring, unethical people will try sketchy things to get a $15 minimum wage. Number 7. Unethical rent-seeking costs such as the casting couch. Economist. I'm sure that you would engage in above-board networking, but some people with lower morals might do anything to get a $15 per hour job. Activist. Are you saying that a $15 minimum wage would cause sexual exploitation? Economist. I'm sure every large corporation has policies against trading sex for favors in addition to it being illegal. But just like every Hollywood studio has policies against casting couches, it does happen. At a free market wage of, say, $7.25, nobody would trade sex for a job. They would just go get a different job across the street. At $15 per hour, unethical people would trade sex for a job. I don't have higher expectations for fast food assistant managers than I have for Hollywood movie producers. Activist. Surely trading sex for a job won't happen that often. Economist. Sleeping with the boss to get ahead happens. If you want to find out how often trading sex for jobs happens, raise the minimum wage to $15. I don't agree, but some libertarians argue that prostitution is a victimless crime. If a Hollywood movie producer wants to spend his own money on prostitutes, that's one thing. If a Hollywood movie producer working for a company wants to use company money on a casting couch that is also theft from the company and harms most job seekers who want nothing to do with a casting couch, I don't see any reason to give shopping mall assistant managers casting couch powers. Economist. Have you seen the movie Forrest Gump? Activist. Yes, Forrest Gump was an inspirational movie. Economist. Before, people such as Forrest Gump were mainstreamed into regular schools when possible. Do you remember how Forrest Gump's mother got Forrest Gump into a regular school? Activist. Forrest Gump's mother, played by Sally Field, bribed the school principal with sex. Economist. It may have been entertaining in the movie and show how far people will go for their children, but we want to minimize the opportunities for people to trade sex for favors. Why create millions of opportunities for sexual exploitation or other types of exploitation? Economist. But most people will not go to such extremes to get a job. Most of the rent seeking to find scarce $15 an hour jobs will be very long job searches and networking or making friends or contacts who can help find jobs. Unfortunately, the people who like the networks to find a $15 minimum wage job, people without affluent friends or family, are the people who most need a first minimum wage job to get their first work experience, their first step on the job ladder. Number 8, knocking the first step off the job ladder for people who need it the most. And number 9, reduce job training for everyone. Economist. Who needs a minimum wage job more? An affluent suburban youth or a poor inner city youth with one unreliable parent? Activist. Obviously, the inner city youth needs the job more, not only for the money, but for the role models and work experience. Economist. Today, at a $7.25 minimum wage, who do you think has a better chance of finding a minimum wage job? An affluent suburban youth or a poor inner city youth? Activist. Even today, with a low minimum wage, affluent suburban youth living near suburban malls will likely find a minimum wage job faster than at-risk youth. Economist. And if it becomes harder to find minimum wage jobs because the minimum wage is $10 or $15 and it takes hundreds of hours of job search or networks of friends and family to find a minimum wage job, who do you think will likely find a minimum wage job? An affluent suburban youth or a poor inner city youth? Activist. Affluent suburban youth will have even more of an advantage finding minimum wage jobs because they know more people, such as affluent family and friends, who can help them find jobs. Economist. You previously mentioned that you had a few minimum wage jobs or near minimum wage jobs when you were a student. What did you learn from those jobs? Activist. I learned what jobs I did not like and what work I did like. From observing more experienced workers, I also learned how to deal with customers, even rude customers. Economist. And, like most people, you were able to add a few jobs to your resume to help you move up the job ladder. Since you went to college, you could have got your first step on the job ladder after college if you had to. But do you think some at-risk youth who is not college material and barely makes it through high school would do well? Activist. At-risk youth who can't find minimum wage jobs are at risk of never getting on the job ladder. Economist. If you could not find a minimum wage job because the minimum wage was too high, you likely would have turned out okay. You might have less experience working with rude customers, but you would have gone to college and eventually obtained a better job. At-risk youth who do not get a first minimum wage job might end up unemployed for decades, on welfare, or even worse, if with too much free time they hang out with the wrong crowd. Activist. Doesn't the city have a summer jobs program to provide jobs to many youth because of all these benefits working provides? Economist. Yes, the city does have a summer jobs program designed to provide work experience and mentors to some, often at-risk youth, but it's only for 8 weeks in the summer. These government work programs for at-risk youth are just a drop in the bucket of the total number of minimum wage jobs. Raising the minimum wage will take away millions of job opportunities for at-risk youth who need the opportunity the most. Many of these at-risk youths will no longer be at risk, but will be ruined by not getting their first minimum wage job. Number 10, very inaccurate redistribution. Some of the poor gain, some of the poor lose. Some of the rich gain, more of the rich lose. Activist. But won't some of the poor, the lucky ones who remain employed, benefit from the higher wages? Economist. Who do you see working here at this McDonald's? Activist. I see some employees who look like young, affluent suburban kids, someone with tattoos on his neck who looks like he could have been a gang member, some young married women with wedding rings on their fingers, and a few immigrants who barely speak English. Activist. This brochure says that the typical minimum wage worker is a single mother supporting 2 children. Economist. If you read the fine print, the brochure likely says that the typical worker who will be helped by an increase in the minimum wage, someone working for $7.25, $8, $9, or $10 an hour or even higher, is a single mother. Economist. Restaurant owners claim that the typical minimum wage worker is a single teenager living in a household with an average income of $70,000. Activist. Which is true. It can't both be true that the typical minimum wage worker is a single mom and a rich suburban teenager. Economist. Actually, by using different definitions of minimum wage worker, one can come up with different typical workers. If one defines a minimum wage worker as a worker literally earning $7.25 and not a cent more, mostly workers just starting out who have not received a single raise are counted. These workers who have never received even a single small raise are often teenagers on their first job. They are likely to be the 2 suburban teenagers at this McDonald's. Economist. But if you define minimum wage workers as everyone who will come under the new minimum wage or even higher because of the ripple or spillover effects, and count everyone earning up to $11 per hour, more adults are included in the count. This likely counts as the adult workers here at this McDonald's. Economist. But in any case, regardless of how minimum wage worker is defined, much of the increase in minimum wage will go to affluent suburban teenagers or middle-class workers. Economist. The Congressional Budget Office, in their 2014 minimum wage report, calculated that just 19% of the $10.10 minimum wage increase would go to families with earnings below the poverty level, or 81% of a $10.10 minimum wage would go to families with earnings above the poverty level. For an ideal redistribution, how much of the redistributed money would we want to go to those below the poverty line? Activist. Ideally, we would want 100% of the money to go to those below the poverty line, or maybe 50% go to those below the poverty line, with the other percent going to families just above the poverty line. Only 19% of the money going to people below the poverty line sounds inaccurate. Economist. Even if we increase the families that we want to help to include families up to twice the poverty level, which is $48,200 and $2,013 for a family of 4, according to the Congressional Budget Office, only 15% of the increase in minimum wage will go to these families. The other half would go to families earning more than twice the poverty level. Economist. In addition to the poor not receiving much of the higher minimum wage, the poor will also pay for much of the higher wage and higher prices. Just glancing at the customers at this McDonald's, who do you see? Activist. I see students who, if not poor, are also likely working for or near the minimum wage. I see an old retired couple who might be poor. I see some poor homeless people. I also see some middle-class families and 1 or 2 rich people, judging from the cars in the parking lot. Economist. A good proportion of the higher minimum wage will be paid for by these poor people when they pay the higher prices at McDonald's. The poor often don't or can't work and are on a fixed or low income. So we have a redistribution policy where much of the money goes not to the intended poor and much of the money does not come from the intended rich. Virtually all economists realize that minimum wage redistribution is a very inaccurate or blunt because 50% or 80% of the redistribution misses its target, the poor, depending on how the target is defined. Activist. In the military, they would not give you a gun if you missed the target 50% or 80% of the time. This sounds like the redistributionist gang that could not shoot straight. Number 11. Introduction to Part 2. An interesting discussion on how many jobs will be lost, not unemployment, but it really does not change the fact that a high minimum wage is an awful idea in any case. Economist. Did you study the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in school? Activist. I lived in Hawaii, so I know about Pearl Harbor. Economist. The attack on Pearl Harbor was a tactical success. Historians debate if the Japanese could have done better by attacking American aircraft carriers instead of obsolete battleships and so on. It's an interesting tactical discussion, but even if the Japanese sunk American aircraft carriers instead of obsolete American battleships, the outcome of the war would not change. Activist. I agree that there is no way the Japanese could have won World War II even if they did catch all the American aircraft carriers at Pearl Harbor. But what does the attack on Pearl Harbor have to do with the minimum wage? Economist. Both the Japanese in World War II and minimum wage activists today might have limited tactical successes, but both the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor and a high living minimum wage are strategic blunders of monumental scale, and any time spent discussing a limited tactical success in one battle is a red herring to the strategic folly. Economist. It does not really matter if after raising the minimum wage, if 0%, 10%, 20%, 30%, or 40% of the workers at McDonald's will lose their jobs. Raising the minimum wage is an awful idea for the 10 reasons we previously talked about, even if the number of workers of McDonald's remains at 100% of the pre-minimum wage number. Activist. But if 0%, 10%, 20%, 30%, or 40% of the workers at McDonald's lose their jobs, won't it matter to the workers losing their jobs? Economist. Of course it will matter to the individual workers losing their jobs. It would have mattered to the American servicemen at Pearl Harbor if 10%, 20%, 30%, or 40% more became casualties. But even if the Japanese had caused twice as much damage as Pearl Harbor, it would not change the outcome of the war. The Japanese would lose in any case. Economist. Japanese propaganda in 1942 was saying, "We won at Pearl Harbor, so we will win the war." Activist. That was obviously ridiculous because it would have taken half a dozen things, starting with an industrial base in the same ballpark as America's industrial base, to successfully take on the USA. Economist. The new economics claim that we won one battle, so we will win the war, is also ridiculous since many conditions have to be met for an efficient policy. Of course, people like to talk about the battles they have won, even if their wins are few and far between and don't affect their strategic outcome. Number 12. There will be virtually no mass layoffs of workers if the minimum wage is raised to $10. Economist. If the minimum wage is increased approximately 40% from $7.25 to $10.10, there will not be mass layoffs of 40% of the workers or even 10% of the workers in the short term. If one literally applied the full information, perfect information, frictionless, instantly adjusting supply and demand analysis taught in Econ 101, one would expect workers to be laid off when a minimum wage is imposed. Activist. Will some people be laid off? Economist. A few businesses will not be able to pass the minimum wage cost increase onto customers and will have to close and lay off their workers. If the minimum wage is raised 10%, even economists who think minimum wage jobs will be lost think the percentage of jobs lost will be small number, like 1.5% of working teenagers. Scaling 10% up to 40% by multiplying by 4, a 40% increase in the minimum wage would reduce the number of jobs by only 6%, which is a very rough estimate. Activist. A 6% decline in jobs does not sound too bad for a 40% pay raise. Economist. 6% sounds like a small number, but 6% of the labor force affected by the minimum wage increase is very roughly 500,000 jobs lost. This would be in addition to the millions of people unemployed and misemployed that we previously discussed. Activist. So, if an additional 500,000 jobs disappear, will 500,000 people be laid off? Economist. How many people do you think work at this McDonald's? Activist. I see maybe 10 people working at this McDonald's right now. Economist. If there are 5 full-time shifts of 10 people each working at this McDonald's, that would be 50 people working at this McDonald's. If only 6% of the positions have to cut because the minimum wage rises to $10, only 3 of the 50 positions will have to be cut. Activist. So 3 people would be laid off at this one McDonald's. Economist. 3 positions would be cut, but people don't have to be laid off. The manager could cut everyone's hours by 6%, or given the high worker turnover at fast food restaurants, a manager could just wait a few weeks or a few months until 3 out of 50 workers quit. There's usually several months' notice before a minimum wage increase, so it rarely catches businesses by surprise. Businesses can just reduce their hiring slightly before and after a minimum wage increase. Activist. So nobody could be laid off? Economist. The number of positions could easily be reduced by 6% without laying off anyone by just waiting for workers to leave. Therefore, very few people were ever laid off after a minimum wage increase. There are very few people walking around griping, "I was laid off after a minimum wage increase," or "I lost my job when the minimum wage increased." Activist. I've never heard anyone say I was laid off after a minimum wage increase. Economist. I've never heard anyone say it either, although it must happen rarely at a few businesses put out of business by a minimum wage increase. But these businesses must have been barely viable before the minimum wage increase. As the McDonald's manager reduces his workforce from 50 to 47 by just not hiring anyone for a few weeks, people seeking jobs will just be told, "We have no openings now." Activist. I was often told when applying for jobs, "We have no openings." Economist. The fact that almost nobody knows anyone who was laid off after a minimum wage increase in the past might be a reason why the public thinks minimum wages won't lead to many mass layoffs, which is true. But the lack of layoffs also gives the impression that no jobs are lost when the minimum wage increases. Economist. Economists have more specific methods than just observing their friends or relatives not being laid off after minimum wage increases. But even with good scientific methods, it's still hard to determine the effect of raising the minimum wage on number of jobs, employment, for several reasons. Number 13. As a percentage of the total jobs, the effect of raising the minimum wage on the number of jobs is small and close to zero, if not zero, and is difficult to distinguish from zero. Economist. We did a ballpark estimate that the number of people working at this McDonald's is now 50. And if the minimum wage was increased approximately 40% from $7.25 to $10, if everything else remains a constant, a ballpark estimate would be that 6% or 3 of the 50 positions will be cut. Activist. I remember that phrase, "if everything else remains constant," used almost every day in my Econ 101 class. Economist. In the real world, not everything remains constant. Almost everything changes. The national economy could grow rapidly or enter a recession. The local area could have a huge population growth or a population decline. A dozen other things could happen that would affect sales and jobs at this McDonald's. Economist. If we came back to this McDonald's and counted the number of workers after a minimum wage increase, depending on the economy and other factors, there could be 45 workers here next year if the local economy was in decline, 47 workers here as expected if everything remained constant, 50 workers here if the local economy grew, or even 55 workers here if both the local and national economy grew, giving people more discretionary income to spend at this McDonald's increased the number of workers on each shift from 10 to 11 workers. Activist. So if the minimum wage increases and this McDonald's location gets lucky and either the local economy grows or the national economy grows, the number of people working at this McDonald's may stay the same at 50 or even increase to 55 workers. Economist. Yes, but it would be the growing economy, not the increase in the minimum wage, that would be the cause of either no change in employment or even a slight increase in employment. At the old $9 wage, this McDonald's might even have employed 60 workers. This McDonald's might be so busy that it would hire 12 workers per shift if it could hire them at $9 per hour. Economist. But the main problem is that even if one observes 47, 50, or 55 people working at this McDonald's after a minimum wage increased to $10, it's difficult to tell what caused the change in the number of jobs. Number 14, Card Krueger fast food surveys. Extraordinary claims based on telephone surveys. Economist. Let's use the example of our Arab oil cartel again. Suppose you worked for an Arab oil cartel and conducted a survey of gas stations in New Jersey and found that after a 25-cent state gasoline tax increase sometime in the past that raised the price of gasoline 25 cents, the gallons of gasoline sold remained constant. What do you think the Arab oil cartel would ask you? Activist. They would ask me how I conducted the survey and how good the data was. They would also ask if the results are still true today and will they be true in the future. Economist. And if you told them that it was a telephone survey where you called up the gas stations and asked the manager who picked up the phone how many customers they had? Activist. That sounds like a telephone poll, which I usually answer as quickly as possible to get off the phone. The Arab oil cartel would tell me it's a good start, but to get better data. Economist. The David Card and Alan Krueger, Card Krueger studies of the new economics of the minimum wage were based on telephone surveys of fast food restaurants in New Jersey. The telephone surveys are described in their book, Myth and Measurement. Economist. Obviously, reading real employment data off paper or computer records would be more accurate than a telephone poll or survey. Other researchers have gone back and looked at the actual records and found, as one would expect, that there were numerous mistakes in the Card Krueger telephone survey. A few random errors, one data point too high offsetting a data point too low, would not be the worst thing, but some errors bias the results according to later researchers. Economist. Other labor economists, David Newmark and William Washer, have looked at the actual numbers, the payroll data, and found that raising the minimum wage at fast food restaurants in New Jersey did in fact reduce employment. But Card and Krueger again somehow found other data and again claimed that the high New Jersey minimum wage did not reduce employment at New Jersey fast food restaurants. Economists can only agree that the results are contentious. Activist. Why do economists get different results from studying the same New Jersey fast food restaurants? Economist. The problem is trying to separate the effects of a growing local economy or a dozen other factors from the effect of the minimum wage increase. For example, if the local economy in New Jersey was growing rapidly, the growing company would overwhelm the small negative or neutral effects of a minimum wage increase. Activist. But economists must try to correct for these other causes? Economist. Economists do try to correct for these other causes, but it's not easy to convincingly correct for other causes. For example, Card and Krueger try to correct for any changes in the New Jersey economy by comparing New Jersey fast food jobs to Pennsylvania fast food jobs. But since the New Jersey economy is not the Pennsylvania economy, the comparison or control is far from perfect. It is an endless matter of debate. Economist. But the debate between small change and no change in the number of jobs, but a small change of tens of millions of workers is hundreds of thousands of jobs lost. Number 15. Why raising the minimum wage had or has a small or no effect on the number of jobs as a percent of the total jobs. Economist. It's difficult to measure small effects, and it's difficult to tell if small effects are significantly different from zero. Gasoline is usually thought of as a product with very inelastic demand. Contrary to our Arab oil cartel survey example of the demand for gasoline not changing at all, in actuality, if the price of gasoline increases by 10%, in the short run, the demand for gasoline will fall by about 2.5%. Even before the new economics of the minimum wage came along and claimed that there would be zero change in employment with a rise in minimum wage, labor economists usually thought a 10% increase in the minimum wage would reduce teen employment by only 1 or 2%, which is less than the 2.5% for gasoline. Activist: why is the change in employment so small? Economist: labor costs at McDonald's restaurants locations are only about 30% of sales, or even slightly less than 30%. Food, such as the meat and cheese for Big Macs, obviously costs money. This McDonald's table and building costs money. McDonald's advertising costs money. Because on this location, costs paid to these workers at this location are only about 30% of the sales, increasing the 30% labor cost by 10% would only increase total cost 3% to 103% of the pre-minimum wage cost. Increasing total cost 3% is not that pressing of an increase when the cost can be passed on to customers. In the past, when the minimum wage was lower, the vast majority of even teenage fast food workers were paid above the minimum wage. If all the workers at this McDonald's are already paid $10 or higher, will increasing the minimum wage to $10 have any effect on jobs at this McDonald's? Activist: no, just like where I work. We pay everyone over $10 an hour, so a minimum wage of $10 an hour won't affect us at all. Economist: if half the workers at this McDonald's earn under $10 an hour and half the workers earn over $10 an hour, what effect will the minimum wage change have? Activist: just like before, workers earning over $10 an hour will be unaffected. The half of the workers earning under $10 will be affected. For workers earning $7, $8, or $9 an hour, if a minimum wage requires a raise to $10 an hour, some jobs might be eliminated. Economist: if a worker was earning $9.90 before a minimum wage increased to $10, just 10 cents under the new minimum wage, do you think his job would be at risk? Activist: likely management would not even think about a 10-cent raise and give him or her a 10-cent raise from $9.90 to $10. Economist: if a worker was earning an even $9 before a minimum wage increased to $10, do you think his job would be at risk? Activist: management would think more about keeping the worker when the minimum wage law mandated a $1 raise. But if the worker was worth it, management would give him the dollar raise from $9 to $10. Economist: if a worker was earning an even $8 before a minimum wage increased to $10, do you think his job would be at risk? Activist: management would think even more about keeping the worker when the minimum wage law mandated a $2 increase than a $1 increase. Economist: the point is that for a nominal increase in the minimum wage of $3 from $7 an hour to $10 an hour, the average increase in wages is much less than $3, so the effect on the number of jobs is low. The average worker getting a raise likely is earning around $8.50 and would get a raise of only $1.50 an hour. In the past, when the minimum wage was very low in both nominal and real terms, economists had to go to a poor southern state to find fast food restaurants and look at only teenage non-adult employment to find that nearly half, not even half, of the teenage workers received between the old minimum wage and new minimum wage, not literally at the old minimum wage, who received a raise to the new minimum wage when the minimum wage rose. Economist: with so few workers affected by the minimum wage increases in the past, and even many of those affected only slightly, in the past, the minimum wage had only a slight or maybe no effect on the number of jobs. Whether the effect is still small in the future when the minimum wage affects more and more workers is still questionable. Monopsony. Is this McDonald's run like it's the only employer in a mining company town? Activist: This activist brochure says that monopsony economics and a higher minimum wage will increase the number of jobs at this McDonald's. Economist. The textbook example of a monopsony is a single employer, such as a mine in a company mining town in the middle of nowhere. But we can stretch the monopsony analysis to this McDonald's. Suppose this McDonald's is running short staff shifts of 9 people instead of the normal 10 people. To keep this example simple, assume all 9 workers earn $8 per hour. At $8 per hour, the manager can't find a 10th person to work the shift. Because of the lack of the 10th person on the shift, customer lines are long, and some customers walk out without ordering. Assume these lost customers cost McDonald's $12 an hour in lost profits. Would McDonald's hire a 10th person for $9 an hour? Activist. I remember this from my Econ 101 class. If McDonald's hired one more person at $9, McDonald's would earn $12 an hour to cover the $9 cost and earn $3 more every hour. But if McDonald's pays the 10th person $9 an hour, the other people working for $8 are going to demand $9 an hour also. The pay raises of the existing workers and the cost of the new worker will exceed $12. So McDonald's will not hire a 10th worker at $9 per hour because they can't without giving raises to existing employees. Economist. You did pay attention in Econ 101. But if the minimum wage is changed to $10 per hour, and assuming the productivity of the first 10 workers is all above $10 per hour, because of diminishing marginal productivity, 10 workers will be hired. Activist. And 10 workers per shift is more than 9 workers per shift. Economist. But what happens if the minimum wage is increased to $13? Activist. At $13 per hour, the 10th worker who only produces $12 per hour would not be hired. So employment would be back to 9 workers per shift. Economist. In a monopsony model, when the wage is pushed too high, conventional supply and demand analysis applies, and the number of jobs falls. Activist. How can you tell if McDonald's is acting like a monopsony buyer of labor and pushing wages down? Economist. If this McDonald's was pushing down wages to $8 and wanted to hire more people at $8 an hour, there would be help wanted signs on the doors here. McDonald's would be hiring everyone they could, which does not appear to be the case in this economy in 2014. Activist. I have not seen help wanted signs at this McDonald's or any of the other stores here in years. Economist. Also arguing against McDonald's as a monopsony theory is that at this McDonald's, people can walk across the street to the mall to see if other businesses are hiring at $9 an hour. The textbook example of a monopsony is a mine in a company mining town in the middle of nowhere where workers can't find alternative employment. Applying the monopsony model to suburban McDonald's restaurants requires stretching of the definition of a monopsony from a single buyer, of labor in this case, with total market power to slightly different buyers with slight market power. Number 17. Bargaining models and market power. Economist. In bargaining models, there is a price or wage range in which people bargain. There's not a set market price. In the labor market, each individual worker is different, and employers are not entirely sure how good each job applicant is. Likewise, workers don't know how hard each job will be, and workers are not entirely sure what other workers across the street are making. Activist. When I was working part-time in high school, some of my friends were earning 25 cents or 50 cents more than other friends were earning for very similar work. I did think that I might earn 50 cents an hour more, but it was just a summer job, so because of inertia, I never applied for a slightly better paying job. Economist. Likewise, because of inertia, your boss might not try to replace you to save 50 cents per hour, especially if there was a good chance the new worker could turn out to be a less productive worker than you. Economist. But the point is that there is a bargaining range, maybe plus or minus 50 cents, or maybe plus or minus $1 for unskilled jobs where both employer and employee would still go through with the deal. There are many mathematical models of bargaining, which are too complicated to explain here. But these bargaining models usually have a range of prices or wages where both sides would agree to the deal. Activist. I remember these bargaining models from college. Both sides are trying to negotiate for a larger slice of the pie. Sometimes negotiations fail because one or both sides demand or hold out for too much. I think I even lost a job because I asked for a salary of $40,000 right out of college. Economist. By eliminating negation below the minimum wage, negation costs and failed negations are eliminated. Also, it's generally assumed that minimum wage workers are not as good negotiators as the employers hiring them. So, within limits, in theory, a minimum wage job could raise the wage within the negotiating range without job losses. Activist. But once the minimum wage is too high, like the $40,000 I asked for right out of college, jobs will be lost? Come to think of it, $15 an hour is about $30,000 per year, and close to the too high $40,000 I asked for just out of college. Economist. Monopsony, bargaining, and some other models allow for a small increase in the wage without jobs lost, even an increase in jobs in the monopsony model, but only up to a point. Number 18. Nonprofit organizations, unlike McDonald's, can't pass the cost increase along to customers. Fewer services to the needy will be provided. Economist. Fast food restaurants may be able to pass along their cost increases to their customers, but organizations which are not businesses, such as nonprofits and local governments, usually can't pass along their cost increases. We already talked about one program, summer jobs for at-risk kids. Activist. I do remember seeing the mayor on TV trying to raise more money to hire more at-risk kids for summer jobs. I can't remember the exact numbers he was saying, but it was something like we can hire 1,000 more at-risk kids, give them work experience, and keep them off the street if we had a few million more dollars. Economist. That sounds about right. At $3,000 per kid for an 8-week work program, 1,000 kids times $3,000 each would be $3 million. If the minimum wage approximately doubles from $7.25 to $15 per hour, what is going to happen to the cost per kid? Activist. The cost per kid working a summer job is going to double from about $3,000 per kid to $6,000 per kid. Economist. If the mayor is having a hard time finding $3 million to help 1,000 kids, do you think he will have any chance of finding $6 million? Activist. I doubt the mayor could find $6 million, and $15 an hour seems way too much to pay 15-year-old kids. Even giving them summer jobs may set them on the right path. Economist. And if the mayor gets the same exact amount of money as last year for his at-risk youth summer jobs and the minimum wage doubles to $15, how many at-risk youth will he be able to hire this summer? Activist. With the same budget for at-risk youth summer jobs, but the cost almost doubles from $7.25 to $15, the mayor will obviously have to cut the number of summer jobs by about 50%. Wait, a 50% job loss sounds awful, especially for at-risk youth. Economist. Many other nonprofit groups that rely on minimum wage labor to provide services to the needy also are not going to be able to pass on their costs to the needy. There are many groups who hire minimum wage workers to visit the elderly and or deliver meals to them. Just like the city with at-risk youth summer jobs, these groups have a limited budget. These nonprofit organizations often oppose a higher minimum wage because they will have to cut services to the needy. Economist. Even if the mayor or these nonprofit groups are able to raise more money at a higher cost at the margin, it may not be worth providing the services. You said yourself that a $15 an hour wage to at-risk youth sounds high. People might just decide it's not worth the cost at $6,000 to provide a summer job for an at-risk youth, while it was worth the cost at $3,000. Economist. Likewise, if you are a foundation funding meals for the elderly and the price of meals rises from $5 to $7 per meal because of higher labor cost, even if you had a limitless amount of money, would you fund more meals at $5 or $7? Activist. Even if I had limitless money, I, like anyone, would take a hard look and see if the meals were worth it to the needy at $7. People would fund fewer meals at $7 a meal than at $5 a meal. Economist. Between McDonald's, who can pass most of their costs on to customers, and nonprofits that can't pass any of their costs on to customers, many businesses are in the middle ground. This has been a matter of much debate, But just because employment does not decline much at fast food restaurants does not mean employment will not decline in other businesses or nonprofit organizations. Number 19. In the long run, people will buy efficient gasoline-saving cars. In the long run, employers will buy efficient labor-saving equipment. Economist. In the short run, when the price of gasoline increased, what did you do? Activist. I drove a little less by combining trips. We drove the small family car more than the large SUV. Economist. In the long run, when the price of gasoline increased, what did you do? Activist. I bought a fuel-efficient Toyota Prius. Economist. In the long run, when the cost of minimum wage workers increases, what do you think employers will do? Activist. Employers will replace workers with machines. Economist. In the long run, after several years, when people can buy new cars or move closer to the jobs so they have a shorter commute, gasoline sales will decline even more. In the short run, gasoline sales fall about 2.5% for a 10% increase in the price of gasoline. But in the long run, after people buy smaller cars, gasoline sales fall about 5.5% for a 10% increase in the price of gasoline. Activist. That's over twice as much of a fall in gasoline sales in the long run compared to the short run. Will the number of minimum wage jobs fall by over twice as much in the long run as it did in the short run? Economist. Twice the number of jobs lost in the long run as lost in the short run sounds like a good guess, but nobody really knows for sure. Nobody really knows if people will buy more fuel-efficient hybrid cars or move closer to their jobs to reduce commuting costs. Nobody knows what future hybrid cars will be like or how efficient they will be since they have not been invented yet. Likewise, nobody knows what future automated fast food restaurants will be like or how efficient they will be since they have not been invented yet. But it's certain that the long-run change of anything, loss of minimum wage jobs in this case, is more than the short-run change because people have more time to adjust. Number 20. A minimum wage increase is the worst Keynesian stimulus that I have ever heard of. Activist. What about this statement, which was signed by many economists? Research suggests that a minimum wage increase could have a small, stimulative effect on the economy as low-wage workers spend their additional earnings, raising demand and job growth and providing some help on the job front. Economist. In one sentence, they put in 4 weasel words: suggests, could, small effect, and some help. It is obvious they could not get their liberal supporters to sign a firm statement saying, a minimum wage increase will definitely have a large positive effect on the job front. Economist. The argument is that fast food workers living paycheck to paycheck will spend 100% or nearly 100% of their income. It may not be 100% of their income, but I agree it's pretty close. So, at first glance, it sounds like more money will be spent. But where's the pay raise coming from? Activist. The pay raise is mostly coming from McDonald's customers, but some may come from McDonald's managers and stockholders. Economist. So the customers and McDonald's will have less money to spend, exactly offsetting the money McDonald's workers have to spend. Activist. So spending will be a wash. There will be no effect on total spending? Economist. On average, McDonald's customers may be slightly richer than McDonald's workers and spend 90% of their money on average and save 10% on average. So shifting money from people who may spend 90% of their income to 100% of their income might increase spending by 10% of the increased wages, and that might be multiplied, such as doubled, by a Keynesian multiplier. Activist. It sounds like you have doubts about it. Economist. First, doing something to increase spending by 10% is a tenth as effective as a stimulus that would increase spending by 100%, such as building new roads or new parks. Economist. Then there's the risk of crowding out private investment with any Keynesian stimulus. If the McDonald's customers took the money they save, the 10%, and saved their money in a bank or financial market, the same money would be loaned out to someone else and spent usually as an investment. So we could end up with the money McDonald's employees spend reducing investment by the same dollar amount, crowding out investment, leading to no stimulus effect. Economist. Finally, the economy only needs a Keynesian stimulus when the economy is underperforming, which should be half the time or less often. Applying a Keynesian stimulus when the economy is doing well, which should be half the time or more, will overheat or overstimulate the economy. It is a Keynesian stimulus that won't work most of the time because of crowding out of investment, and a stimulus that can't be turned off because no politician is going to lower minimum wages when a stimulus is not needed. Economist. I could quote you statements from some of the same economists who signed that letter, saying the stimulative effect of a minimum wage is so small as to be ineffective. Number 21. Ripple or spillover benefits are also ripple costs and ripple distortions. Activist. This brochure says not only minimum wage workers will get a raise to $10, but their supervisors will get a raise to $11, more than the minimum wage, to keep supervisors' wages above wages of the minimum wage workers they supervise. Economist. It is a social norm that supervisors get paid slightly more than the workers they supervise. Suppose the entry-level wage at this McDonald's is $8 per hour, and the lowest level supervisor, an assistant shift supervisor or manager, gets $1 more, or $9 per hour. If the minimum wage is increased to $10 an hour, the ripple effect argument says that the assistant shift supervisors will receive a raise to $11 to keep supervisors' wages $1 higher than the entry-level workers' wages. Activist. A raise to $11 sounds good. Economist. Everything sounds good if you list the benefits but pretend there are no costs, which is what minimum wage advocates usually do. Who do you think is going to pay for the raise to $11? Activist. We, the customers, are going to pay for most of the raise to $11. Economist. So at best, it's a zero-sum game where we pay more and someone receives the money as a pay raise. But it's much worse than a zero-sum game since the previous distortions also apply. The entry-level assistant supervisor pay structure was $8 and $9 per hour. After the minimum wage increased to $10, the lowest legal entry-level assistant supervisor pay structure would be $10 and $10. And if, because of social norms, the entry-level assistant supervisor pay structure becomes $10 and $11, which pay structure do you think would lead to more job applicants at McDonald's? Activist. If workers knew that they could advance to an $11 per hour assistant supervisor position, we would have even more job applicants. Economist. With even more job applicants, more people trying to supply their labor, we would have even more unemployment and more of all the distortions we discussed. Number 22. Conclusion. 10 unavoidable problems and more likely problems. Economist. To summarize, the 10 unavoidable problems are: 1. Millions more unemployed even if the number of jobs remains constant. 2. Just as the wrong high-cost oil will be used at a too high price, the wrong high-cost labor will be used at a too high wage, reducing total output. 3. Mandatory discrimination against the disadvantaged. Nobody will buy disadvantaged oil or hire disadvantaged labor. 4. In the long run, at $7 per gallon gasoline, more people will drill for oil. In the long run, at a $10 or $15 minimum wage, more people will choose to become or stay minimum wage workers for life. 5. Job lock and few minimum wage job openings. People will be locked into whatever minimum wage jobs they find, even if it's the worst job for them. 6. Wasteful rent-seeking job search costs. 7. Unethical rent-seeking costs such as the casting couch. 8. Knocking the first step off the job ladder for people who need it the most. 9. Reduced job training for everyone. 10. Very inaccurate redistribution. Some of the poor gain, some of the poor lose. Some of the rich gain, more of the rich lose. Activist. After looking at the 10 unavoidable problems and the other likely problems, why would anyone want a high minimum wage? References with author comments. Minimum Wages, a 377-page book by two leading labor economists, David Newmark and William L. Washer, describes decades of research on the minimum wage. A summary scorecard is presented at the end of the book, which shows the harm and lack of help from past minimum wage increases. In my opinion, one sentence from the book sums up the economic research on the minimum wage. Indeed, we would argue that upon examining the scorecard in Table 9.1, the question that virtually leaps off the page is, why would we want a higher minimum wage? Page 286. Myth and Measurement, subtitled The New Economics of the Minimum Wage, is a 422-page book by two economists, David Card and Alan B. Krueger, that largely describes their own research, including research on the New Jersey fast food restaurants, where they find the number of fast food jobs did not decline after a minimum wage increase. In the title, they literally call other results myths, and in the subtitle claim to have some new economics. In my opinion, Card and Krueger set up a straw man argument, say standard economics is wrong because it's not perfect, and propose a new economics. This new economics is actually an old economics theory that did not pan out. Card and Krueger discuss and even dedicate their book to one of these old theorists, Richard Allen Lester. The Logic of Collective Action by Mancor Olson is not on the general minimum wage, but is a much broader book on collective action in general, which includes labor unions. Labor unions engage in collective action. In my opinion, this is the new real economics. My opinion may be biased since I studied under Mancor Olson just as Card and Krueger worked under or with Richard Allen Lester. In The Logic of Collective and a follow-up book, The Rise and Decline of Nations, Olson argues that groups undertaking collective action in their own limited self-interest usually hurt the wider public interest. I've taken some of these arguments and other arguments, including my own papers in the appendix, and applied these arguments to the minimum wage. A Measure of Fairness by Robert Poland, two other professors, and one non-professor, is one of the best books arguing for an increase in the minimum wage. Unfortunately, one can only argue for a high living minimum wage if one ignores, downplays, or just does not understand the negative aspects, as this book and Myth and Measurement do. Minimum Wage, Maximum Damage, How the Minimum Wage Law Destroys Jobs, Perpetuates Poverty, and Erodes Freedom by Jim Cox, also an economics professor, is a short, older-style argument against the minimum wage. It is, at this time, an Amazon.com Kindle ebook for $2.99. Like the previous book, A Measure of Fairness, it is an interesting, one-sided read.